Imagine waking up tomorrow with $100 million in your bank account.
Oh, the dream, right.
Right. It's the ultimate dream. You immediately quit your high pressure job, you sell the house in the suburbs, and you just relocate to this pristine private island.
Yeah, you just unplug completely.
Exactly. And for the first 30 days, the absence of that alarm clock, it feels like this literal biological miracle.
Oh, for sure. It's pure relief at first.
But, and this is where it gets crazy, by day 90, you are experiencing this state of, well, neurological decay.
Yeah.
And it closely resembles clinical depression. Like that pristine ocean view outside your window, it doesn't even register as beautiful anymore.
Oh, it just becomes background noise.
Worse than that, it registers as a terrifying static void. So today, we're doing a deep dive into why the ultimate financial dream for, roughly 90% of the population represents a literal psychological nightmare for a very specific type of human brain.
It's a fascinating phenomenon. And it really forces us to completely discard our conventional models of, like, leisure and reward.
Right.
Because when we examine the source material for this deep dive, we aren't looking at some, sociological critique of wealth. We're looking at a fundamental hardware difference.
Hardware, like how the brain is actually wired.
Exactly. It's about how certain minds process sensory input versus structural logic. So for one group of people, the cessation of labor is like the ultimate evolutionary victory.
You win the game, you start playing.
Right. But for the other group, the cessation of complex problem solving triggers an immediate systemic neurobiological crisis.
Which is just wild to think about. So welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Our mission today is to unpack this profound, honestly kind of alienating disconnect between these two types of operating systems.
Yeah, alienating is a really good word for it.
Because on one side, you've got individuals who view financial freedom as the ultimate off switch. The freedom to travel, consume, and simply exist without any demands.
The standard retirement fantasy.
Yeah, right. But on the other side, we have people who experience severe existential dread at the mere thought of a life stripped of continuous escalating challenges.
And we are going to dissect the actual mechanics of that dread today. We'll be mapping this behavioral divide onto specific neurobiological frameworks.
Yeah, we're getting into the science of it.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
We're exploring how the thermodynamics of the mind, and specifically stuff like psychic entropy and information theory, how that dictates our baseline reality.
which sounds intense, but it makes so much sense once you break it down.
It really does. The goal is to figure out the exact mechanisms that cause concepts like work, leisure, and boredom to trigger completely inverted neurochemical responses.
Depending entirely on the cognitive architecture of the individual.
Exactly.
So whether you're, currently grinding through a brutal corporate hierarchy and just counting the seconds until retirement, or if you're someone who secretly finds more psychological stability in a complex spreadsheet than you do on a vacation.
Which is more common than you'd think.
Definitely. Either way, this deep dive is going to fundamentally rewire how you understand your own brain's reward circuitry.
It really strips away all those moral judgments we usually attach to things like workaholism or laziness, right? It just reduces them to raw biological imperatives.
Yeah, it takes the guilt out of it.
Right.
So let's start by isolating the exact point of friction here. The sources use this super familiar scenario to anchor the whole thing.
The water cooler conversation.
Yes, the classic water cooler hypothetical about winning the lottery. We've all been there.
Yeah.
You have coworkers who confidently declare that the second the check clears, they will never, ever look at a spreadsheet again.
Not even a glance.
Right. They intend to spend the rest of their lives just traveling and experiencing high-end cuisine.
And then the user in our source material hears this.
Yeah, the user hears this and responds genuinely perplexed, like, but wouldn't that be incredibly boring?
And the coworkers just stare at them.
Exactly. They are simply unable to parse the question. To them, the user sounds insane, or maybe just like arrogantly posturing.
Yeah, like they're trying to sound superior. But the breakdown in communication happens because both parties are operating under wildly different mathematical definitions of what work actually is.
Right.
We really have to look at the equations driving these two realities. Because for the coworkers, work is processed as a cost of survival.
A biological tax.
Precisely. The variables are pressure, constraint, and the depletion of metabolic and psychological energy. It is quite literally a tax on their existence.
So if work is purely a tax, then the logical conclusion is that reducing that tax to zero maximizes human flourishing. I mean, they are solving for the absence of pain.
Exactly. It's a perfectly rational equation if you use those variables. But the user's brain, it runs a totally different equation.
Which is where the disconnect happens.
Right. For this cognitive profile, work is not a survival tax at all. It is the primary mechanism for self-actualization.
Okay, let's unpack this. What does their equation look like?
Their equation defines work as the synthesis of order, escalating challenge, and a critical continuous system of value feedback. So when you tell that person you're taking away their work, you aren't removing a tax. You are removing their entire apparatus for engaging with reality.
Which is terrifying. And this really introduces the philosophical framework the source touches on, which is the duality of freedom.
Yes.
We often treat freedom as this monolithic concept, just one big idea, but there's a massive structural difference between freedom from and freedom to.
Negative versus positive liberty.
Exactly. Freedom from is negative liberty. It is the removal of external constraints, no boss, no deadlines, no forced obligations.
And negative liberty is undeniably intoxicating in the short term. I mean,
Yeah.
the physiological relief of removing chronic cortisol spikes from a toxic job, that is very real.
Oh, absolutely. You can literally feel your blood pressure drop.
Yeah, but negative liberty provides no internal vector. It clears the stage, but it doesn't write the play.
That's a great way to put it.
And the source text makes a fascinating observation about this. Once the immediate exhaustion is resolved, usually within a few months of quitting the marginal utility of simply not being told what to do, it just plummets.
It drops off a cliff.
Yeah.
And that creates what they call the existential vacuum.
Right.
Because if your entire identity was built around resisting an external pressure, what happens to your structural integrity when that pressure evaporates in a vacuum?
You collapse.
Yeah.
Just cave in on yourself. Unless you possess what the text identifies as a massive internal drive.
And what does that look like in practice?
It's an autonomous engine that generates its own positive liberty, or freedom too. This is the freedom to construct things, to map new territories, to engineer systems entirely on your own terms.
Okay, I have to push back slightly here on behalf of the listener.
Go for it.
The way we are framing the coworker's desire to travel and eat, it makes it sound entirely passive, almost vegetative. But traveling requires logistics. It requires adaptation and engaging with new cultures. Isn't that a form of freedom to, why does the source classify the pursuit of new experiences as inherently different from the pursuit of building systems?
That's a really crucial distinction. And the source answers it by categorizing the two approaches as tourists versus builders.
Tourists and builders, okay.
Yeah. So when the coworkers imagine traveling, they're still primarily operating as consumers of an environment, not architects of it.
Right.
A tourist moves through a background script that was written by geology or history or, a massive hospitality conglomerate.
Right, they're just walking onto a set.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The variables are novel, but the cognitive interaction is essentially passive consumption.
Ah, okay, I see. A builder, on the other hand, looks at the exact same environment and cannot simply consume it.
They physically can't.
Like if a builder goes to a historic city in Europe, they aren't satisfied just taking a nice photograph of the architecture. Their brain automatically starts reverse engineering the load-bearing columns. Or they start analyzing the urban planning that allowed the city to function over centuries. They can't turn it off.
Precisely. Because the builder requires a feedback loop where their own logic acts upon the environment and then the environment pushes back.
Right, there has to be a resistance.
Exactly. If you force a builder into a pure tourist itinerary, where their only job is to look at things and state whether they taste good or look pretty, they experience a severe psychological confinement.
It feels like a trap.
Yeah, the lack of a logical feedback loop literally feels like sensory deprivation to them.
So we've established the behavioral divide here. We have the tourist consuming the script versus the builder writing it.
Right.
But we need to look under the hood. Why does the exact same visual stimulus, say, looking at a magnificent mountain range, trigger a deep sense of peace in one brain and this restless, almost painful agitation in another?
And this is where the source points us away from philosophy and straight into the mechanics of neurochemistry.
Yeah, specifically contrasting dopamine pathways with endorphin responses.
Right. Exactly. To understand this, we really have to look closely at how the brain processes different types of novelty. Dopamine is often completely misunderstood simply as the pleasure chemical.
Like it's just a joy button you push.
Right. But it's not. It's actually the anticipation and reward prediction error neurotransmitter.
Reward prediction error, what does that mean?
It means dopamine spikes when we encounter an unexpected sensory reward or a novel environment. So for the tourist mindset, Traveling to a new country or eating a new Michelin-starred meal provides a massive dopamine surge.
Because it's unexpected high-quality sensory input.
Yes, it is a form of high-level sensory compensation.
But the architecture of the dopamine system is inherently self-defeating if you try to use it as a long-term strategy for fulfillment.
Oh, completely self-defeating.
Because this is the mechanism of hedonic adaptation, right?
Right, and what's fascinating here is that it's not just a psychological habituation where you just get used to things.
Yeah.
It is a structural downregulation at the synaptic level.
Wait, really? The brain physically changes?
Yes. If you flood your receptors with high-intensity sensory novelty every single day, the brain, which is constantly seeking homeostasis, physically reduces the number of available dopamine receptors. The baseline shifts.
Wow. So, month 1 of your Wealth Freedom World Tour, the Aurora Borealis, is breathtaking. The dopamine release is intense.
Peak experience.
But by month 3, because your receptor density has completely downregulated, the magnificent scenery fails to trigger a sufficient prediction error.
It just doesn't compute as special anymore.
The brain categorizes the extraordinary as the mundane. The premium Wagyu beef is literally just protein. The glacier is just ice.
And when that sensory novelty fails to bridge the gap, the individual often attempts to solve the problem by increasing the dosage.
Right. More extreme travel, more expensive consumption.
Exactly. It becomes this static treadmill that eventually leads to a profound sense of nihilism, simply because the biological ceiling of sensory pleasure has been hit.
You literally max out your hardware. Now, contrast that mechanism with the primary driver of the builder or the user in our text.
Yeah, this is the flip side.
They aren't chasing the sensory dopamine spike at all. They are chasing what the text identifies as the aha moment.
The moment of cognitive synthesis.
Yes. And the neurochemical signature of this is entirely different, isn't it?
It is. The aha moment is driven heavily by the endorphin system, alongside a highly specific, targeted release of dopamine that's tied to pattern recognition, rather than pure sensory input.
Okay, so endorphins. We usually associate those with, like, runner's high, right?
Yeah.
Endogenous opioids.
Exactly. They are typically associated with physical exertion or pain mitigation, but they are also deeply, deeply involved in the relief and satisfaction that follows intense, sustained cognitive effort.
So when you spend hours, like, just wrestling with a complex problem, there is a literal physiological tension in the brain.
Yes, it builds up.
And when the logic finally clicks, when you finally see how all the disparate variables form a cohesive system, the release of that tension triggers an endorphin cascade.
And what's really vital to understand about the cognitive leap versus the sensory thrill is the structural aftermath of that event.
The aftermath.
Yeah. When you synthesize a new logical framework, your brain releases something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF.
Okay, BDNF.
Yes. So
Yeah.
you are actually promoting synaptic plasticity. You are creating new permanent neural pathways.
That is incredible. So the unit of happiness for the builder isn't the transient intensity of the enjoyment, it's the structural delta of the learning.
Precisely.
It's the physical construction of a denser, more capable neural network.
Right. The tourist relies on changing the external environment to constantly stimulate the same static neural pathways. But the builder relies on keeping the external environment relatively stable.
Like just sitting in a quiet room with a whiteboard.
Exactly, while radically expanding their internal neural architecture. The endorphin release from a cognitive leap provides a stable, long-lasting sense of meaning because it physically alters the brain's capability.
Which perfectly explains why the concept of boredom means two completely different things to these groups.
Totally different.
Like if a tourist's dopamine receptors downregulate and they feel numb, they call that boredom. But the sources redefine boredom for the builder through the lens of physics.
Yeah, this part is wild.
We are looking at boredom not as a lack of external activity, but as a state of psychic entropy.
This is where the source material is just exceptionally sharp. It actually brings in thermodynamic concepts to explain cognitive decay.
Thermodynamics in psychology. Wait, how does that work?
Well, in physics, the second law of thermodynamics states that the total entropy, which is the measure of disorder or randomness of an isolated system, can never decrease over time.
Right.
If a system is closed and no energy is applied to it, it naturally degrades into chaos.
And the human mind is not exempt from the laws of physics.
Not at all.
The coworkers operate under this illusion that the mind is a static object. They really believe that if you remove the stress of the workplace, the mind will just naturally settle into this peaceful, frictionless equilibrium.
They view not working as a stable state.
But the builder intrinsically understands that the mind is an open, dynamic system. It requires constant inputs of negative entropy or negentropy to maintain its structural integrity.
Yes. In information theory, negentropy is essentially the measure of order and predictability. The brain must constantly process highly complex information to fight off the natural drift toward cognitive disorder.
So, what does this all mean? If the builder is subjected to a pure leisure lifestyle, just eating and traveling every day, they aren't receiving negative entropy.
No, the sensory inputs of vacation are way too low resolution to challenge their cognitive architecture.
Exactly.
And when a high-capacity brain is starved of complex, organizing logic, it doesn't just, power down into standby mode.
It doesn't just take a nap.
No, the lack of structured challenge causes the system to degrade. The neural networks begin to experience noise. The source actually describes this terrifying endpoint as a mental heat death.
A mental heat death.
Yeah. Without the continuous injection of complex problem solving, the individual's sense of self, their purpose, and their grip on reality begin to dissolve into chaotic, anxious static.
This maps so perfectly onto the psychological concept of flow, which was popularized by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and which the sources allude to here.
Oh, absolutely. Flow is the ultimate state of negentropy.
But it has a very rigid prerequisite, right? It only occurs when there is a precise balance between a high level of challenge and a high level of personal skill.
Right. If the challenge is high and the skill is low, you get anxiety.
Makes sense.
And if the skill is high and the challenge is low, you get apathy and boredom.
And here is the fatal flaw in the lottery winner fantasy. Consuming luxury experiences requires absolute zero skill.
None at all.
Anyone can sit on a beach. Literally anyone can let a chef place a piece of tuna in front of them. And because the skill requirement is zero, the challenge is zero. Therefore, entering a flow state is mathematically impossible.
It can't happen.
For a mind that relies on flow states to maintain its structural order against that tide of psychic entropy, a life of endless vacations is a literal death sentence for their consciousness.
It is. But this brings up a really profound contradiction that the source material tackles directly.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's look at the environment where this water cooler conversation is actually happening. The sources specifically mention highly intelligent people, like L4 engineers at major tech companies, places like Google.
Right. We are talking about top-tier cognitive talent here. These aren't people who lack the hardware for complex thought. They literally build complex systems for a living.
Exactly. So the obvious question is, if this flow and aha moment is so crucial for human fulfillment, why do these brilliant engineers still romanticize the low-entropy tourist lifestyle?
Yeah, why aren't they demanding constant cognitive leaps in their fantasies?
This introduces what we can call the Google paradox.
The Google paradox. I think the key here is separating the capability of the intellect from the ultimate purpose of the intellect.
That's spot on.
The source argues that for the vast majority of high achievers, their exceptional intelligence is utilized merely as a lever.
Yes, a lever to extract social and financial resources. They are applying all their cognitive bandwidth to master algorithms, pass these grueling technical interviews, and secure massive equity packages.
Right.
But the underlying operating system is still that of the settler. They are using the builder's tools, but their ultimate objective is to accumulate enough resources to finally turn the cognitive engine off.
They use their brains to get the Google job, to get the money, to buy the right to stop thinking.
Precisely. Whereas the user in the text, the true builder, uses their life, their resources, and their time specifically to feed their brain.
So for the true builder, the complex problem isn't the obstacle standing in the way of the reward.
No.
The complex problem is the reward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there is an additional layer complicating this Google paradox, and it has to do with the long-tail physiological effects of chronic stress.
Right, because these tech environments are hyper-competitive. They generate sustained levels of cortisol and adrenaline.
They do. And the source notes that when these engineers dream of doing absolutely nothing, we shouldn't necessarily interpret that as their true baseline preference for existence.
It's more of a trauma response, isn't it?
It is a profound trauma response. The text actually describes this as a need to fill past pits.
Fill past pits?
Yeah. When an individual has spent a decade operating in a state of chronic cortisol-driven hyperarousal, their entire neurobiological system is heavily indebted.
So the desire to lie on a beach for 5 years isn't some pursuit of actualization.
No, it is a desperate, long-term compensation mechanism required to just reset their autonomic nervous system back to baseline.
They are just trying to get back to zero. But the user in the text, assuming their basic survival and financial needs are met, they aren't focused on filling past pits. They are aggressively scanning the horizon for future peaks.
Exactly. And to illustrate this difference in cognitive demands, the source uses this highly effective technological metaphor.
Oh, the console analogy. I love this one.
Yeah, it compares the true builder's brain to a high-end 4K gaming console or a top-tier GPU.
Let's really look at the mechanics of that analogy because it perfectly captures the physical discomfort of boredom.
It really does.
A 4K processor is engineered to render incredibly dense, dynamic, high-resolution environments. It is built to process millions of variables simultaneously.
Right.
So if you take that hardware and force it to run a pixelated 8-bit game, let's call the game Travel and Eat, you don't just get a smooth experience, you get severe performance waste.
Yes. And here's the critical difference. In a computer, unused processing power just sits idle. But in the human brain, massive amounts of unutilized cognitive capacity don't go dormant.
Right.
The default mode network, which is the network active when the brain is wakeful but not focused on the outside world, it goes into overdrive.
It starts misfiring.
Exactly. The brain begins to cannibalize itself with predictive coding errors, generating hypothetical scenarios, existential doubts, rumination.
Cognitive hunger.
Yes. The 4K processor, being starved of a high-resolution external puzzle, turns its analytical power inward, analyzing the self until it generates profound anxiety.
And the tragedy for the builder is that society constantly gaslights them about this anxiety.
Oh, constantly.
The coworkers, whose processors might naturally operate totally efficiently on the 8-bit game of daily consumption, they don't experience this idle anxiety.
No, they feel great.
And furthermore, society actively rewards playing the 8-bit game through the mechanism of social currency.
That's a critical point. The travel and consumption lifestyle generates immense external validation.
Right, you post the photo of the Amalfi Coast, and the social network provides a synthetic dopamine loop through likes and envy.
It's a feedback loop of pure status. And this external loop acts as a structural prop. It artificially delays the onset of true psychic entropy for the tourist, allowing them to mask their lack of internal purpose with changing geographic coordinates and just, the digital applause of their peers.
So the builder is standing there experiencing agonizing psychic entropy because their 4K processor is starving, while literally everyone around them is cheering for the 8-bit game and telling the builder they are crazy for not enjoying it.
It's incredibly isolating.
It inevitably leads to the question, right? Is the builder pathological? Like, if you cannot enjoy the simple, universally desired pleasures of life, if a day at the beach gives you an existential crisis, are you neurologically broken? Are you sick for not enjoying normal things?
And it is incredibly common for these individuals to seek therapy thinking they are broken. But the source material emphatically depathologizes this trait.
Okay, so it's not an illness.
It argues that this is absolutely not a psychological illness or a trauma response. It is a high-level cognitive evolutionary adaptation.
The individual has fundamentally rewritten their internal hierarchy of needs. They've essentially bypassed the standard survival instinct operating system and are permanently running a mental self-actualization operating system.
Yes. And to understand how this fits into human history, the source maps this onto evolutionary roles, specifically the dynamic between scouts and settlers.
Scouts and settlers.
Yeah. So we discussed the settlers earlier. They are the co-workers. Evolutionarily, the settler prioritizes stability, the accumulation of resources, and sensory safety.
Right, they ensure the survival of the species by locking down the known territory, building the village, farming the land.
Exactly. But the species only expands its territory because of the scouts. And a scout requires a completely different neurobiological incentive structure.
How so?
Well, if a scout was satisfied by a warm fire and a full stomach, they would never leave the cave.
Ah, that makes perfect sense.
Therefore, evolution must wire the scout to feel a deep physical revulsion to the known.
Wow. So the scout is biologically penalized for remaining in a static, solved environment.
Yes.
They are only rewarded with neurochemical stability when they are on the frontier, navigating high ambiguity and mapping new rules.
Exactly. And there is hard genetic evidence to back up this scout and settler divide.
Wait, really? Genetics?
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source specifically points to the DRD4 receptor, the dopamine D4 receptor.
Okay.
We touched on dopamine earlier, but we need to look at the genetic expression of the receptors that actually catch the dopamine.
Right, the hardware that receives the signal.
Exactly. This is where the psychology becomes physiology. The DRD4 gene has various alleles, most notably the 7-repeat allele, which is heavily associated with novelty-seeking behaviors.
Interesting.
And it's found in much higher frequencies in human populations with longer migratory histories. But what's crucial here is how this specific receptor expression alters the perception of reward.
How does it alter it?
Well, in a standard brain, sensory novelty, a new taste, a new sight, it fits perfectly into the dopamine receptors, providing strong satiety.
But for the brain heavily reliant on these novelty-seeking expressions, the threshold is entirely different.
Completely different.
The DRD4 dominant brain, the scout, rapidly desensitizes to mere sensory input. They require structural novelty.
Yes, cognitive novelty.
Right. They need to uncover a hidden mechanism or solve a dynamic system to achieve the exact same feeling of reward.
For the settler, getting something for nothing, maximizing resource gain while minimizing energy output, that is the evolutionary jackpot. Getting $1 million for doing nothing feels perfect.
Right.
But for the scout, the act of expending massive cognitive energy to force a logical system to click, that is the objective. The energy released from that cognitive synthesis vastly overpowers the primitive pleasure of passive consumption.
This aligns seamlessly with the personality theories mentioned in the text, too, specifically looking at the INFP or INTJ archetypes, introverted intuition and feeling, that drive for deep internal logical consistency.
Excellent.
It also forces a total reevaluation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
It really does. Because usually we think of Maslow's hierarchy as this linear progression.
Right. You secure food and shelter first, then you worry about social belonging, then esteem, and maybe, if you have time and energy at the end, self-actualization.
Exactly. But for the builder, once the bare minimum of physical survival is met, the middle tiers basically collapse.
They just vanish.
Yeah. Their psychological baseline immediately jumps to the apex. Their need for cognitive closure and aesthetic understanding isn't a luxury. It operates with the exact same biological urgency as hunger.
So depriving them of complex problems isn't a vacation, it's starvation.
Literal starvation for the brain.
Now, all of these neurobiological and evolutionary frameworks are incredibly compelling, but they require a real-world anchor, right?
Yeah, we need to see it in action.
If this 4K processor, DRD4 scout profile, is real, what does a successful manifestation of it actually look like? Who acquires the resources to become the ultimate tourist, but chooses to remain the relentless builder?
And the source provides an impeccable textbook case here,
Yeah.
David Swenson.
Yes, David Swenson. Let's talk about him. Who was he, for those who don't know?
David Swenson is the perfect exemplar because he operated in an environment entirely defined by extreme wealth and the pursuit of capital. Yet, his internal motivations were entirely decoupled from consumption.
Right.
Swenson was the legendary chief investment officer of the Yale Endowment Fund for decades.
And to really understand the magnitude of his discipline, we have to look at his options. Swenson revolutionized institutional investing. He possessed an intellect and a track record that Wall Street would have paid literal billions for.
Oh, absolutely. He could have written his own check anywhere.
He could have managed a massive hedge fund, accumulated unfathomable personal wealth, and spent the last 30 years of his life just sitting on a super yacht in the Mediterranean.
He had absolute, unrestricted access to the ultimate freedom from negative liberty.
But he consciously rejected it.
He did.
He chose to remain at Yale, a university setting, taking a massive discount in personal compensation compared to the private sector.
Right. And if we view him through the lens of the coworkers at the water cooler, his behavior is deeply irrational.
It makes no sense to them.
But through our framework, his choices are mathematically perfect. Swenson was entirely driven by the endorphin rush of cognitive growth and system optimization.
Let's look at the mechanics of the system he built. Because he didn't just, pick good stocks. He fundamentally restructured the underlying logic of institutional wealth management.
Yes, he completely changed the game.
Before Swenson, endowments heavily relied on traditional modern portfolio theory. The 60-40 portfolios, mostly domestic equities and highly liquid bonds.
Right, very standard stuff.
But Swenson looked at the timeline of university. The university theoretically exists forever, therefore it does not need the same level of daily liquidity as a retail investor.
And that was his ultimate aha moment. He realized that by sacrificing short-term liquidity, he could capture the illiquidity premium in alternative assets like private equity, venture capital, and absolute return strategies.
And this became known globally as the Yale model.
Exactly.
And the really vital point here is why he stayed. Implementing the Yale model wasn't a one-time transaction. It was the creation of a massive, dynamic, multivariable investment ecosystem.
Yes.
Proving his theories against the chaotic reality of global markets, continuously refining the logic as the world changed over decades, that feedback loop was his neurobiological lifeblood.
He achieved what the source calls systematic survival by attaching his intellect to a puzzle that was effectively infinite and infinitely complex. He created a permanent state of negentropy.
Right, a low-entropy state that protected him from the void.
Exactly. He insulated his mind completely against the existential vacuum because there was always a higher peak of optimization to scale.
And the text includes a detail about Swenson that completely solidifies this theory, and honestly, it's deeply moving.
Yeah, it's the most poignant detail in the whole source.
David Swenson was diagnosed with cancer and fought a brutal battle with the disease for 9 years.
9 years.
And throughout that entire period of physical decline, right up until his death, he continued to manage the endowment, and he continued to teach his students at Yale.
It is the ultimate, tragic, beautiful proof of the builder's operating system.
Yes.
Because when faced with a terminal illness, the settler instinct would scream to drop all responsibilities, conserve energy, and consume as much comfort as possible in the remaining time.
Go to the beach, rest.
Right. But for Swenson, stepping away from the intellectual puzzle would have meant succumbing to psychic entropy before the biological entropy took him.
For a cognitive-driven brain, stopping the logical building process is a fate literally worse than death.
It is.
The work wasn't a distraction from his mortality. The maintenance of that complex logical order, was the very definition of being alive. To stop building would have been a premature death of the self.
It fundamentally redefines work from labor to the maintenance of life's cognitive order.
It's just an awe-inspiring framework. But it also leads us to a very practical, immediate problem for the rest of us.
Right, because we can't all be David Swenson.
Exactly. Swenson got to think about high-level portfolio theory all day. But what happens to the builder brain when it is trapped in the mundane?
Yeah, bridging this high-level theory down to daily anxiety.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the user, in our source, admits to feeling actual physical anxiety when forced to perform low-scale repetitive tasks.
And this brings the theory crashing down into daily reality. Because we all, regardless of our cognitive capacity, have to deal with bureaucracy, data entry, repetitive chores.
Laundry, emails.
Right. And when you force the builder's high-tier processor brain to execute low-tier repetitive instructions, you initiate a literal system error.
Let's break down the mechanics of that anxiety. It's not just frustration, is it? The source describes it as the generation of parasitic signals.
Exactly. When the 4K processor is given a low-tier task, the task only utilizes perhaps 5% of the available cognitive bandwidth. But the remaining 95% of the network doesn't power down. Because it is starved of the complex external input it needs to maintain flow, it turns inward.
The redundant computing power starts generating noise.
Yes. The default mode network begins to hyperfixate on the self.
The unutilized computing power becomes parasitic. It starts questioning the point of the task, which spirals into questioning the trajectory of your career, which spirals into doubting the fundamental meaning of your existence.
That's brutal.
You are filling out an expense report, and suddenly your brain is panicking about time passing and sounding an alarm that you are wasting your one wild and precious life.
The anxiety is actually a withdrawal symptom.
Reward circuit starvation.
Yes. The reward circuits are expecting the endorphin hit of an aha moment, and instead they're receiving static. Furthermore, it triggers severe cognitive dissonance regarding identity.
How so?
Well, the builder anchors their self-worth in their identity as a problem solver. When they are forced to act purely as a biological algorithm, just moving a number from column A to column B without any structural analysis, they are stripped of their identity anchor.
They are reduced from an architect to a porter.
Exactly.
And the brain responds to that demotion with sheer panic. So, what's the solution? How does the source suggest we navigate this? Because, like you said, we can't all manage the Yale endowment. How do you survive the mundane if your brain requires complex logic to ward off entropy?
The source offers a highly actionable survival tactic here. They call it metacognitive reconstruction.
Metacognitive reconstruction.
Yes. It relies on the application of second-order logic to transform the nature of the task itself.
So if the primary task is fundamentally boring, you refuse to engage with it on its primary level.
Precisely. Let's take the mundane example of manually formatting a weekly data report. If you approach it as a porter, you will suffer psychic entropy. You will be miserable. Metacognitive reconstruction demands that you change the objective. Your goal is no longer to finish the report. Your goal is to engineer a system that annihilates the necessity of the report.
You teach yourself Python or advanced macroscripting simply to automate the task.
Yes.
Even if learning to code the automation takes 10 times longer than just doing the report manually this week, the time spent is irrelevant.
Completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because the goal isn't efficiency. The goal is the generation of a complex puzzle.
You are intentionally embedding a high-resolution puzzle inside the 8-bit game.
Exactly. By shifting the objective from completing the chore to optimizing the workflow system, you force a micro aha moment out of a sterile, barren landscape.
You trick your brain into a flow state.
Yes, thereby protecting your structural integrity from the decay of the mundane. You ensure that you are always acting as a builder, even when the environment demands a tourist.
That is an incredibly potent strategy for anyone listening who feels trapped by the daily grind. Don't just do the boring form. Figure out how to write an automated script to destroy the form forever.
Force the cognitive leap.
Well, we have navigated an immense conceptual landscape today. We started with a simple, frustrating conversation at a water cooler, and we followed the thread down into the thermodynamics of the human mind.
We explored the genetic divergence of the DRD-4 Scout.
And we examined the beautiful, relentless architecture of David Swenson's life.
It really highlights that the pursuit of a challenge isn't a rejection of peace. For a specific type of mind, the challenge is the only pathway to peace.
So, the definitive takeaway for you listening. If you have ever felt a profound, isolating sense of dread when everyone else is eagerly discussing their plans to do absolutely nothing on a beach,
If the concept of pure consumption feels like a slow death to you,
you are not broken, you are not sick, you are not incapable of happiness, you are simply operating a high-capacity cognitive architecture that refuses to run low-resolution software.
you're a 4K console.
You are a scout, you are a builder whose stability relies entirely on the slope, the delta of learning, the physical thrill of the cognitive leap, and the relentless generation of order out of chaos.
Not status, not just having things.
Right. Wealth freedom for you is not the freedom to stop. It is simply the ultimate freedom to buy your own time so you can lock on to harder, purer, and infinitely more complex aha moments.
And this leaves us with a final, really necessary provocative thought to consider, building on everything from the source.
Let's hear it.
We live in an economy, an entire global infrastructure, really, that is explicitly structurally designed to cater to the settler.
Right. Offering easy sensory dopamine at every single turn.
Exactly. The algorithms that power our devices are engineered to deliver low-friction dopamine at an unprecedented scale, actively discouraging the deep, sustained focus required for endorphin-driven cognitive leaps.
The 8-bit game is everywhere.
It is. So given this reality, how many potential scouts, how many brilliant high-capacity processors are out there right now suffering from profound anxiety and medicating their cognitive boredom with endless digital scrolling?
Wow.
And they're doing it simply because they haven't realized their brains are literally starving to death for a complex problem to solve.
A terrifying thought to sit with, and a powerful reminder to fiercely protect your own cognitive hunger. Keep finding your puzzles, keep building your systems, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.